The Mysterious Island, by Jules Verne. Part 2, Chapter 13. "A castaway!" exclaimed Pencroft. "Left on this Tabor Island not 200 miles from us! Ah, Captain Harding, you won't now oppose my going?" "No, Pencroft," replied Cyrus Harding, "and you shall set out as soon as possible." "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow." The engineer still held in his hand the paper which he had taken from the bottle. He contemplated it for some instants, then resumed. "From this document, my friends, from the way in which it is worded, we may conclude this: first, that the castaway on Tabor Island is a man possessing a considerable knowledge of navigation, since he gives the latitude and longitude of the island exactly as we ourselves found it, and to a second of approximation. Secondly, that he is either English or American, as the document is written in the English language." "That is perfectly logical," answered Spilett, "and the presence of this castaway explains the arrival of the case on the shores of our island. There must have been a wreck, since there is a castaway. As to the latter, whoever he may be, it is lucky for him that Pencroft thought of building this boat and of trying her this very day, for a day later and this bottle might have been broken on the rocks." "Indeed," said Herbert, "it is a fortunate chance that the Bonadventure passed exactly where the bottle was still floating." "Does this not appear strange to you?" asked Harding of Pencroft. "It appears fortunate, that's all," answered the sailor. "Do you see anything extraordinary in it, Captain? The bottle must go somewhere, and why not here as well as anywhere else?" "Perhaps you are right, Pencroft," replied the engineer, "and yet—" "But," observed Herbert, "there's nothing to prove that this bottle has been floating long in the sea." "Nothing," replied Gideon Spilett, "and the document appears even to have been recently written. What do you think about it, Cyrus?" During this conversation Pencroft had not remained inactive. He had put the vessel about, and the Bonadventure, all sails set, was running rapidly towards Claw Cape. Everyone was thinking of the castaway on Tabor Island. Should they be in time to save him? This was a great event in the life of the colonists. They themselves were but castaways, but it was to be feared that another might not have been so fortunate, and their duty was to go to his succor. Claw Cape was doubled, and about 4 o'clock the Bonadventure dropped her anchor at the mouth of the Mersey. That same evening the arrangements for the new expedition were made. It appeared best that Pencroft and Herbert, who knew how to work the vessel, should undertake the voyage alone. By setting out the next day, the 10th of October, they would arrive on the 13th, for with the present wind it would not take more than 48 hours to make this passage of 150 miles. 1 day in the island, 3 or 4 to return. They might hope, therefore, that on the 17th they would again reach Lincoln Island. The weather was fine, the barometer was rising, the wind appeared settled. Everything then was in favor of these brave men whom an act of humanity was taking far from their island. Thus it had been agreed that Cyrus Harding, Neb, and Gideon Spilett should remain at Granite House. But an objection was raised, and Spilett, who had not forgotten his business as reporter to the New York Herald, having declared that he would go by swimming rather than lose such an opportunity, he was admitted to take a part in the voyage. The evening was occupied in transporting on board the Bonadventure articles of bedding, utensils, arms, ammunition, a compass, provisions for a week. This being rapidly done, the colonists ascended to Granite House. The next day, at 5 o'clock in the morning, the farewells were said, not without some emotion on both sides, and Pencroft, setting sail, made towards Claw Cape, which had to be doubled in order to proceed to the southwest. The Bonadventure was already a quarter of a mile from the coast when the passengers perceived on the heights of Granite House 2 men waving their farewells. They were Cyrus Harding and Neb. "Our friends," exclaimed Spilett, "this is our first separation in 15 months." Pencroft, the reporter, and Herbert waved in return, and Granite House soon disappeared behind the high rocks of the cape. During the first part of the day the Bonadventure was still in sight of the southern coast of Lincoln Island, which soon appeared just like a green basket, with Mount Franklin rising from the center. The heights, diminished by distance, did not present an appearance likely to tempt vessels to touch there. Reptile End was passed in about an hour, though at a distance of about 10 miles. At this distance it was no longer possible to distinguish anything of the western coast, which stretched away to the ridges of Mount Franklin, and 3 hours after, the last of Lincoln Island sank below the horizon. The Bonadventure behaved capitally. Bounding over the waves, she proceeded rapidly on her course. Pencroft had hoisted the foresail, and steering by the compass, followed a rectilinear direction. From time to time Herbert relieved him at the helm, and the lad's hand was so firm that the sailor had not a point to find fault with. Gideon Spilett chatted sometimes with one, sometimes with the other. If wanted, he lent a hand with the ropes, and Captain Pencroft was perfectly satisfied with his crew. In the evening the crescent moon, which would not be in its first quarter until the 16th, appeared in the twilight and soon set again. The night was dark but starry, and the next day again promised to be fine. Pencroft prudently lowered the foresail, not wishing to be caught by a sudden gust while carrying too much canvas. It was perhaps an unnecessary precaution on such a calm night, but Pencroft was a prudent sailor, and cannot be blamed for it. The reporter slept part of the night. Pencroft and Herbert took turns for a spell of 2 hours each at the helm. The sailor trusted Herbert as he would himself, and his confidence was justified by the coolness and judgment of the lad. Pencroft gave him his directions as a commander to his steersman, and Herbert never allowed the Bonadventure to swerve even a point. The night passed quickly, as did the day of the 12th of October. A southeasterly direction was strictly maintained. Unless the Bonadventure fell in with some unknown current, she would come exactly within sight of Tabor Island. As to the sea over which the vessel was then sailing, it was absolutely deserted. Now and then a great albatross or frigate bird passed within gunshot, and Gideon Spilett wondered if it was to one of them that he had confided his last letter addressed to the New York Herald. These birds were the only beings that appeared to frequent this part of the ocean between Tabor and Lincoln Islands. "And yet," observed Herbert, "this is the time that whalers usually proceed towards the southern part of the Pacific. Indeed, I do not think there could be a more deserted sea than this." "It is not quite so deserted as all that," replied Pencroft. "What do you mean?" asked the reporter. "We are on it. Do you take our vessel for a wreck and us for porpoises?" And Pencroft laughed at his joke. By the evening, according to calculation, it was thought that the Bonadventure had accomplished a distance of 120 miles since her departure from Lincoln Island, that is to say, in 36 hours, which would give her a speed of between 3 and 4 knots an hour. The breeze was very slight and might soon drop altogether. However, it was hoped that the next morning, by break of day, if the calculation had been correct and the course true, they would sight Tabor Island. Neither Gideon Spilett, Herbert, nor Pencroft slept that night. In the expectation of the next day they could not but feel some emotion. There was so much uncertainty in their enterprise. Were they near Tabor Island? Was the island still inhabited by the castaway to whose succor they had come? Who was this man? Would not his presence disturb the little colony till then so united? Besides, would he be content to exchange his prison for another? All these questions, which would no doubt be answered the next day, kept them in suspense, and at the dawn of day they all fixed their gaze on the western horizon. "Land!" shouted Pencroft at about 6 o'clock in the morning. And it was impossible that Pencroft should be mistaken. It was evident that land was there. Imagine the joy of the little crew of the Bonadventure. In a few hours they would land on the beach of the island. The low coast of Tabor Island, scarcely emerging from the sea, was not more than 15 miles distant. The head of the Bonadventure, which was a little to the south of the island, was set directly towards it, and as the sun mounted in the east, its rays fell upon one or two headlands. "This is a much less important isle than Lincoln Island," observed Herbert, "and is probably due like ours to some submarine convulsion." At 11 o'clock the Bonadventure was not more than 2 miles off, and Pencroft, while looking for a suitable place at which to land, proceeded very cautiously through the unknown waters. The whole of the island could now be surveyed, and on it could be seen groups of gum and other large trees, of the same species as those growing on Lincoln Island. But the astonishing thing was that no smoke arose to show that the island was inhabited. No signal whatever appeared on the shore. And yet the document was clear enough. There was a castaway, and this castaway should have been on the watch. In the meanwhile, the Bonadventure entered the winding channels among the reefs, and Pencroft observed every turn with extreme care. He had put Herbert at the helm, posting himself in the bows, inspecting the water, while he held the halyard in his hand, ready to lower the sail at a moment's notice. Gideon Spilett with his glass eagerly scanned the shore, though without perceiving anything. However, at about 12 o'clock the keel of the Bonadventure grated on the bottom. The anchor was let go, the sails furled, and the crew of the little vessel landed. And there was no reason to doubt that this was Tabor Island, since according to the most recent charts there was no island in this part of the Pacific between New Zealand and the American coast. The vessel was securely moored, so that there should be no danger of her being carried away by the receding tide. Then Pencroft and his companions, well armed, ascended the shore, so as to gain an elevation of about 250 or 300 feet, which rose at a distance of half a mile. "From the summit of that hill," said Spilett, "we can no doubt obtain a complete view of the island, which will greatly facilitate our search." "So as to do here," replied Herbert, "that which Captain Harding did the very first thing on Lincoln Island, by climbing Mount Franklin." "Exactly so," answered the reporter, "and it is the best plan." While thus talking, the explorers had advanced along a clearing which terminated at the foot of the hill. Flocks of rock pigeons and sea swallows, similar to those of Lincoln Island, fluttered around them. Under the woods which skirted the glade on the left they could hear the bushes rustling and see the grass waving, which indicated the presence of timid animals, but still nothing to show that the island was inhabited. Arrived at the foot of the hill, Pencroft, Spilett, and Herbert climbed it in a few minutes, and gazed anxiously round the horizon. They were on an islet, which did not measure more than 6 miles in circumference, its shape not much bordered by capes or promontories, bays or creeks, being a lengthened oval. All around, the lonely sea extended to the limits of the horizon. No land nor even a sail was in sight. This woody islet did not offer the varied aspects of Lincoln Island, arid and wild in one part, but fertile and rich in the other. On the contrary, this was a uniform mass of verdure, out of which rose 2 or 3 hills of no great height. Obliquely to the oval of the island ran a stream through a wide meadow falling into the sea on the west by a narrow mouth. "The domain is limited," said Herbert. "Yes," rejoined Pencroft. "It would have been too small for us." "And moreover," said the reporter, "it appears to be uninhabited." "Indeed," answered Herbert, "nothing here betrays the presence of man." "Let us go down," said Pencroft, "and search." The sailor and his 2 companions returned to the shore, to the place where they had left the Bonadventure. They had decided to make the tour of the island on foot, before exploring the interior, so that not a spot should escape their investigations. The beach was easy to follow, and only in some places was their way barred by large rocks, which, however, they easily passed around. The explorers proceeded towards the south, disturbing numerous flocks of sea birds and herds of seals, which threw themselves into the sea as soon as they saw the strangers at a distance. "Those beasts yonder," observed the reporter, "do not see men for the first time. They fear them, therefore they must know them." An hour after their departure they arrived on the southern point of the islet, terminated by a sharp cape, and proceeded towards the north along the western coast, equally formed by sand and rocks, the background bordered with thick woods. There was not a trace of a habitation in any part, not the print of a human foot on the shore of the island, which after 4 hours' walking had gone completely round. It was, to say the least, very extraordinary, and they were compelled to believe that Tabor Island was not or was no longer inhabited. Perhaps, after all, the document was already several months or several years old, and it was possible, in this case, either that the castaway had been enabled to return to his country, or that he had died of misery. Pencroft, Spilett, and Herbert, forming more or less probable conjectures, dined rapidly on board the Bonaventure, so as to be able to continue their excursion until nightfall. This was done at 5 o'clock in the evening, at which hour they entered the wood. Numerous animals fled at their approach, being principally, one might say, only goats and pigs, which were obviously European species. Doubtless some whaler had landed them on the island, where they had rapidly increased. Herbert resolved to catch one or two living and take them back to Lincoln Island. It was no longer doubtful that men at some period or other had visited this islet, and this became still more evident when paths appeared trodden through the forest, felled trees, and everywhere traces of the hand of man. But the trees were becoming rotten, and had been felled many years ago. The marks of the axe were velveted with moss, and the grass grew long and thick on the paths, so that it was difficult to find them. "But," observed Gideon Spilett, "this not only proves that men have landed on the island, but also that they lived on it for some time. Now, who were these men? How many of them remain?" "The document," said Herbert, "only spoke of one castaway." "Well, if he is still on the island," replied Pencroft, "it is impossible but that we shall find him." The exploration was continued. The sailor and his companions naturally followed the route which cut diagonally across the island, and they were thus obliged to follow the stream which flowed towards the sea. If the animals of European origin, if works due to a human hand, showed incontestably that men had already visited the island, several specimens of the vegetable kingdom did not prove it less. In some places, in the midst of clearings, it was evident that the soil had been planted with culinary plants, at probably the same distant period. What, then, was Herbert's joy when he recognized potatoes, chicory, sorrel, carrots, cabbages, and turnips, of which it was sufficient to collect the seed to enrich the soil of Lincoln Island. "Capital! Jolly!" exclaimed Pencroft. "That will suit Neb as well as us. Even if we do not find the castaway, at least our voyage will not have been useless, and God will have rewarded us." "Doubtless," replied Gideon Spilett. "But to see the state in which we find these plantations, it is to be feared that the island has not been inhabited for some time." "Indeed," answered Herbert, "an inhabitant, whoever he was, could not have neglected such an important culture." "Yes," said Pencroft, "the castaway has gone." "We must suppose so." "It must then be admitted that the document has already a distant date?" "Evidently." "And that the bottle only arrived at Lincoln Island after having floated in the sea a long time?" "Why not?" returned Pencroft. "But night is coming on," added he, "and I think that it will be best to give up the search for the present." "Let us go on board, and tomorrow we will begin again," said the reporter. This was the wisest course, and it was about to be followed, when Herbert, pointing to a confused mass among the trees, exclaimed, "A hut!" All three immediately ran towards the dwelling. In the twilight it was just possible to see that it was built of planks and covered with a thick tarpaulin. The half-closed door was pushed open by Pencroft, who entered with a rapid step. The hut was empty. End of chapter. The Mysterious Island, by Jules Verne, Part 2, Chapter 14. Pencroft, Herbert, and Gideon Spilett remained silent in the midst of the darkness. Pencroft shouted loudly. No reply was made. The sailor then struck a light and set fire to a twig. This lighted for a minute a small room, which appeared perfectly empty. At the back was a rude fireplace, with a few cold cinders, supporting an armful of dry wood. Pencroft threw the blazing twig on it. The wood crackled and gave forth a bright light. The sailor and his two companions then perceived a disordered bed, of which the damp and yellow coverlets proved that it had not been used for a long time. In the corner of the fireplace were two kettles, covered with rust, and an overthrown pot. A cupboard, with a few mouldy sailor's clothes. On the table a tin plate and a Bible, eaten away by damp. In a corner a few tools, a spade, pickaxe, two fowling pieces, one of which was broken. On a plank, forming a shelf, stood a barrel of powder, still untouched, a barrel of shot, and several boxes of caps, all thickly covered with dust, accumulated perhaps by many long years. "There's no one here," said the reporter. "No one," replied Pencroft. "It is a long time since this room has been inhabited," observed Herbert. "Yes, a very long time," answered the reporter. "Mr. Spilett," then said Pencroft, "instead of returning on board, I think it would be well to pass the night in this hut." "You are right, Pencroft," answered Gideon Spilett, "and if its owner returns, well, perhaps he will not be sorry to find the place taken possession of." "He will not return," said the sailor, shaking his head. "You think that he has quitted the island?" asked the reporter. "If he has quitted the island, he would have taken away his weapons and his tools," replied Pencroft. "You know the value which castaways set on such articles as these, the last remains of a wreck?" "No, no," repeated the sailor, in a tone of conviction. "No, he has not left the island. If he had escaped in a boat made by himself, he would still less have left these indispensable and necessary articles. No, he is on the island." "Living?" asked Herbert. "Living or dead, but if he is dead, I suppose he has not buried himself, and so we shall at least find his remains." It was then agreed that the night should be passed in the deserted dwelling, and a store of wood found in a corner was sufficient to warm it. The door closed, Pencroft, Herbert, and Spilett remained there, seated on a bench, talking little but wondering much. They were in a frame of mind to imagine anything or expect anything. They listened eagerly for sounds outside. The door might be opened suddenly, and a man presented himself to them without their being in the least surprised, notwithstanding all that the hut revealed of abandonment, and they had their hands ready to press the hands of this man, this castaway, this unknown friend, for whom friends were waiting. But no voice was heard. The door did not open. The hours thus passed away. How long the night appeared to the sailor and his companions! Herbert alone slept for 2 hours, for at his age sleep is a necessity. They were all three anxious to continue their exploration of the day before, and to search the most secret recesses of the islet. The inferences deduced by Pencroft were perfectly reasonable, and it was nearly certain that, as the hut was deserted, and the tools, utensils, and weapons were still there, the owner had succumbed. It was agreed, therefore, that they should search for his remains, and give them at least Christian burial. Day dawned. Pencroft and his companions immediately proceeded to survey the dwelling. It had certainly been built in a favorable situation, at the back of a little hill, sheltered by 5 or 6 magnificent gum trees. Before its front and through the trees the axe had prepared a wide clearing, which allowed the view to extend to the sea. Beyond a lawn, surrounded by a wooden fence falling to pieces, was the shore, on the left of which was the mouth of the stream. The hut had been made of planks, and it was easy to see that these planks had been obtained from the hull or deck of a ship. It was probable that a disabled vessel had been cast on the coast of the island, that one at least of the crew had been saved, and that by means of the wreck this man, having tools at his disposal, had built the dwelling. And this became still more evident when Gideon Spilett, after having walked around the hut, saw on a plank, probably one of those which had formed the armor of the wrecked vessel, these letters already half effaced: BR TAN A. "Britannia!" exclaimed Pencroft, whom the reporter had called. "It is a common name for ships, and I could not say if she was English or American."
"It matters very little, Pencroft."
"Very little indeed," answered the sailor, "and we will save the survivor of her crew if he is still living, to whatever country he may belong. But before beginning our search again, let us go on board the Bonadventure." A sort of uneasiness had seized Pencroft upon the subject of his vessel. Should the island be inhabited after all, and should some one have taken possession of her? But he shrugged his shoulders at such an unreasonable supposition. At any rate, the sailor was not sorry to go to breakfast on board. The road already trodden was not long, scarcely a mile. They set out on their walk, gazing into the wood and thickets through which goats and pigs fled in hundreds. 20 minutes after leaving the hut, Pencroft and his companions reached the western coast of the island, and saw the Bonadventure held fast by her anchor, which was buried deep in the sand. Pencroft could not restrain a sigh of satisfaction. After all, this vessel was his child, and it is the right of fathers to be often uneasy when there is no occasion for it. They returned on board, breakfasted, so that it should not be necessary to dine until very late. Then, the repast being ended, the exploration was continued and conducted with the most minute care. Indeed, it was very probable that the only inhabitant of the island had perished. It was therefore more for the traces of a dead than of a living man that Pencroft and his companions searched. But their searches were vain, and during the half of that day they sought to no purpose among the thickets of trees which covered the islet. There was then scarcely any doubt that, if the castaway was dead, no trace of his body now remained, but that some wild beast had probably devoured it to the last bone. "We will set off tomorrow at daybreak," said Pencroft to his two companions, as about 2 o'clock they were resting for a few minutes under the shade of a clump of firs. "I should think that we might without scruple take the utensils which belong to the castaway," added Herbert.
"I think so too," returned Gideon Spilett, "and these arms and tools will make up the stores of Granite House. The supply of powder and shot is also most important."
"Yes," replied Pencroft, "but we must not forget to capture a couple or two of these pigs, of which Lincoln Island is destitute." "Nor to gather those seeds," added Herbert, "which will give us all the vegetables of the Old and the New Worlds."
"Then perhaps it would be best," said the reporter, "to remain a day longer on Tabor Island, so as to collect all that may be useful to us."
"No, Mr. Spilett," answered Pencroft. "I will ask you to set off tomorrow at daybreak. The wind seems to me to be likely to shift to the west, and after having had a fair wind for coming, we shall have a fair wind for going back." "Then do not let us lose time," said Herbert, rising. "We won't waste time," returned Pencroft. "You, Herbert, go and gather the seeds, which you know better than we do. While you do that, Mr. Spilett and I will go and have a pig hunt, and even without Top I hope we shall manage to catch a few." Herbert accordingly took the path which led towards the cultivated part of the islet, while the sailor and the reporter entered the forest. Many specimens of the porcine race fled before them, and these animals, which were singularly active, did not appear to be in a humor to allow themselves to be approached. However, after an hour's chase, the hunters had just managed to get hold of a couple lying in a thicket, when cries were heard resounding from the north part of the island. With the cries were mingled terrible yells, in which there was nothing human. Pencroft and Gideon Spilett were at once on their feet, and the pigs by this movement began to run away, at the moment when the sailor was getting ready the rope to bind them.
"That's Herbert's voice," said the reporter.
"Run!" exclaimed Pencroft, and the sailor and Spilett immediately ran at full speed towards the spot from whence the cries proceeded. They did well to hasten, for at a turn of the path, near a clearing, they saw the lad thrown on the ground and in the grasp of a savage being, apparently a gigantic ape, who was about to do him some great harm. To rush on this monster, throw him on the ground in his turn, snatch Herbert from him, then bind him securely, was the work of a minute for Pencroft and Gideon Spilett. The sailor was of Herculean strength, the reporter also very powerful, and in spite of the monster's resistance he was firmly tied so that he could not even move.
"You are not hurt, Herbert?" asked Spilett.
No.
"Oh, if this ape had wounded him!"
exclaimed Pencroft. "But he is not an ape," answered Herbert. At these words Pencroft and Gideon Spilett looked at the singular being who lay on the ground. Indeed, it was not an ape. It was a human being, a man. But what a man! A savage in all the horrible acceptation of the word, and so much the more frightful that he seemed fallen to the lowest degree of brutishness. Shaggy hair, untrimmed beard descending to the chest, the body almost naked except a rag round the waist, wild eyes, enormous hands with immensely long nails, skin the color of mahogany, feet as hard as if made of horn. Such was the miserable creature who yet had a claim to be called a man. But it might justly be asked if there was yet a soul in this body, or if the brute instinct alone survived in it.
"Are you quite sure that this is a man, or that he has ever been one?" said Pencroft to the reporter. "Alas, there is no doubt about it," replied Spilett.
"Then this must be the castaway?" asked Herbert.
"Yes," replied Gideon Spilett, "but the unfortunate man has no longer anything human about him."
The reporter spoke the truth. It was evident that if the castaway had ever been a civilized being, solitude had made him a savage, or worse, perhaps a regular man of the woods. Hoarse sounds issued from his throat between his teeth, which were sharp as the teeth of a wild beast made to tear raw flesh. Memory must have deserted him long before, and for a long time also he had forgotten how to use his gun and tools, and he no longer knew how to make a fire. It could be seen that he was active and powerful, but the physical qualities had been developed in him to the injury of the moral qualities. Gideon Spilett spoke to him. He did not appear to understand or even to hear, and yet on looking into his eyes the reporter thought he could see that all reason was not extinguished in him. However, the prisoner did not struggle, nor even attempt to break his bonds. Was he overwhelmed by the presence of men whose fellow he had once been? Had he found in some corner of his brain a fleeting remembrance which recalled him to humanity? If free, would he attempt to fly, or would he remain? They could not tell, but they did not make the experiment, and after gazing attentively at the miserable creature,
"Whoever he may be," remarked Gideon Spilett, "whoever he may have been, and whatever he may become, it is our duty to take him with us to Lincoln Island."
Yes, yes," replied Herbert, "and perhaps with care we may arouse in him some gleam of intelligence."
"The soul does not die," said the reporter, "and it would be a great satisfaction to rescue one of God's creatures from brutishness."
Pencroft shook his head doubtfully.
"We must try at any rate," returned the reporter. "Humanity commands us."
It was indeed their duty as Christians and civilized beings. All three felt this, and they well knew that Cyrus Harding would approve of their acting thus. "Shall we leave him bound?" asked the sailor. "Perhaps he would walk if his feet were unfastened," said Herbert.
"Let us try,"
replied Pencroft. The cords which shackled the prisoner's feet were cut off, but his arms remained securely fastened. He got up by himself, and did not manifest any desire to run away. His hard eyes darted a piercing glance at the three men who walked near him, but nothing denoted that he recollected being their fellow, or at least having been so. A continual hissing sound issued from his lips. His aspect was wild, but he did not attempt to resist. By the reporter's advice, the unfortunate man was taken to the hut. Perhaps the sight of the things that belonged to him would make some impression on him. Perhaps a spark would be sufficient to revive his obscured intellect, to rekindle his dulled soul. The dwelling was not far off. In a few minutes they arrived there, but the prisoner remembered nothing, and it appeared that he had lost consciousness of everything. What could they think of the degree of brutishness into which this miserable being had fallen, unless that his imprisonment on the island dated from a very distant period, and after having arrived there a rational being, solitude had reduced him to this condition? The reporter then thought that perhaps the sight of fire would have some effect on him, and in a moment one of those beautiful flames that attract even animals blazed up on the hearth. The sight of the flame seemed at first to fix the attention of the unhappy object, but soon he turned away, and the look of intelligence faded. Evidently there was nothing to be done, for the time at least, but to take him on board the Bonadventure. This was done, and he remained there in Pencroft's charge. Herbert and Spilett returned to finish their work, and some hours after they came back to the shore, carrying the utensils and guns, a store of vegetables, of seeds, some game, and 2 couple of pigs. All was embarked, and the Bonadventure was ready to weigh anchor and sail with the morning tide. The prisoner had been placed in the fore-cabin, where he remained quiet, silent, apparently deaf and dumb. Pencroft offered him something to eat, but he pushed away the cooked meat that was presented to him, and which doubtless did not suit him. But on the sailor showing him one of the ducks which Herbert had killed, he pounced on it like a wild beast, and devoured it greedily. "You think that he will recover his senses?" asked Pencroft. "It is not impossible that our care will have an effect upon him, for it is solitude that has made him what he is, and from this time forward he will be no longer alone." "The poor man must no doubt have been in this state for a long time," said Herbert. "Perhaps," answered Gideon Spilett. "About what age is he?" asked the lad. "It is difficult to say," replied the reporter, "for it is impossible to see his features under the thick beard which covers his face, but he is no longer young, and I suppose he might be about 50. "Have you noticed, Mr. Spilett, how deeply sunk his eyes are?" asked Herbert. "Yes, Herbert, but I must add that they are more human than one could expect from his appearance." "However, we shall see," replied Pencroft, "and I am anxious to know what opinion Captain Harding will have of our savage. We went to look for a human creature, and we are bringing back a monster. After all, we did what we could." The night passed, and whether the prisoner slept or not could not be known, but at any rate, although he had been unbound, he did not move. He was like a wild animal, which appears stunned at first by its capture, and becomes wild again afterwards. At daybreak the next morning, the 15th of October, the change of weather predicted by Pencroft occurred. The wind having shifted to the northwest favored the return of the Bonadventure, but at the same time it freshened, which might render navigation more difficult. At 5 o'clock in the morning the anchor was weighed. Pencroft took a reef in the mainsail, and steered towards the northeast, so as to sail straight for Lincoln Island. The first day of the voyage was not marked by any incident. The prisoner remained quiet in the fore-cabin, and as he had been a sailor, it appeared that the motion of the vessel might produce on him a salutary reaction. Did some recollection of his former calling return to him? However that might be, he remained tranquil, astonished rather than depressed. The next day the wind increased, blowing more from the north, consequently in a less favorable direction for the Bonadventure. Pencroft was soon obliged to sail close-hauled, and without saying anything about it, he began to be uneasy at the state of the sea, which frequently broke over the bows. Certainly, if the wind did not moderate, it would take a longer time to reach Lincoln Island than it had taken to make Tabor Island. Indeed, on the morning of the 17th, the Bonadventure had been 48 hours at sea, and nothing showed that she was near the island. It was impossible, besides, to estimate the distance traversed, or to trust to the reckoning for the direction, as the speed had been very irregular. 24 hours after, there was yet no land in sight. The wind was right ahead, and the sea very heavy. The sails were close reefed, and they tacked frequently. On the 18th a wave swept completely over the Bonadventure, and if the crew had not taken the precaution of lashing themselves to the deck, they would have been carried away. On this occasion Pencroft and his companions, who were occupied with loosing themselves, received unexpected aid from the prisoner, who emerged from the hatchway as if his sailor's instinct had suddenly returned, broke a piece out of the bulwarks with a spar so as to let the water which filled the deck escape. Then, the vessel being clear, he descended to his cabin without having uttered a word. Pencroft, Gideon Spilett, and Herbert, greatly astonished, let him proceed. Their situation was truly serious, and the sailor had reason to fear that he was lost on the wide sea without any possibility of recovering his course. The night was dark and cold. However, about 11 o'clock, the wind fell, the sea went down, and the speed of the vessel, as she labored less, greatly increased. Neither Pencroft, Spilett, nor Herbert thought of taking an hour's sleep. They kept a sharp lookout, for either Lincoln Island could not be far distant, and would be sighted at daybreak, or the Bonadventure, carried away by currents, had drifted so much that it would be impossible to rectify her course. Pencroft, uneasy to the last degree, yet did not despair, for he had a gallant heart, and grasping the tiller he anxiously endeavored to pierce the darkness which surrounded them. About 2 o'clock in the morning he started forward. "A light! A light!" he shouted. Indeed, a bright light appeared 20 miles to the northeast. Lincoln Island was there, and this fire, evidently lighted by Cyrus Harding, showed them the course to be followed. Pencroft, who was bearing too much to the north, altered his course and steered towards the fire, which burned brightly above the horizon, like a star of the first magnitude. End of chapter. The Mysterious Island by Jules Verne, Part 2, Chapter 15. The next day, the 20th of October, at 7 o'clock in the morning, after a voyage of 4 days, the Bonadventure gently glided up to the beach at the mouth of the Mersey. Cyrus Harding and Neb, who had become very uneasy at the bad weather and the prolonged absence of their companions, had climbed at daybreak to the plateau of Prospect Heights, and they had at last caught sight of the vessel which had been so long in returning. "God be praised, there they are!" exclaimed Cyrus Harding. As to Neb, in his joy, he began to dance, to twirl round, clapping his hands and shouting, "Oh, my master!" a more touching pantomime than the finest discourse. The engineer's first idea, on counting the people on the deck of the Bonadventure, was that Pencroft had not found the castaway of Tabor Island, or at any rate that the unfortunate man had refused to leave his island and change one prison for another. Indeed, Pencroft, Gideon Spilett, and Herbert were alone on the deck of the Bonadventure. The moment the vessel touched, the engineer and Neb were waiting on the beach, and before the passengers had time to leap on to the sand, Harding said, "We have been very uneasy at your delay, my friends. Did you meet with any accident?" "No," replied Gideon Spilett. "On the contrary, everything went wonderfully well. We will tell you all about it." "However," returned the engineer, "your search has been unsuccessful, since you are only 3 just as you went." "Excuse me, captain," replied the sailor. "We are 4."
You have found the castaway?"
"Yes."
"And you have brought him?"
"Yes."
"Living?"
"Yes."
"Where is he? Who is he?"
"He is," replied the reporter, "or rather he was, a man. There, Cyrus, that is all we can tell you." The engineer was then informed of all that had passed during the voyage and under what conditions the search had been conducted, how the only dwelling in the island had long been abandoned, how at last a castaway had been captured, who appeared no longer to belong to the human species. "And that's just the point," added Pencroft. "I don't know if we have done right to bring him here." "Certainly you have, Pencroft," replied the engineer quickly. "But the wretched creature has no sense." "That is possible at present," replied Cyrus Harding. "But only a few months ago the wretched creature was a man like you and me. And who knows what will become of the survivor of us, after a long solitude on this island? It is a great misfortune to be alone, my friends, and it must be believed that solitude can quickly destroy reason, since you have found this poor creature in such a state."
"But, Captain," asked Herbert, "what leads you to think that the brutishness of the unfortunate man began only a few months back?"
"Because the document we found had been recently written," answered the engineer, "and the castaway alone can have written it." "Always supposing," observed Gideon Spilett, "that it had not been written by a companion of this man, since dead." "That is impossible, my dear Spilett." "Why so?" asked the reporter. "Because the document would then have spoken of two castaways," replied Harding, "and it mentioned only one." Herbert then in a few words related the incidents of the voyage, and dwelt on the curious fact of the sort of passing gleam in the prisoner's mind, when for an instant in the height of the storm he had become a sailor. "Well, Herbert," replied the engineer, "you are right to attach great importance to this fact. The unfortunate man cannot be incurable, and despair has made him what he is. But here he will find his fellow men, and since there is still a soul in him, this soul we shall save." The castaway of Tabor Island, to the great pity of the engineer and the great astonishment of Neb, was then brought from the cabin which he occupied in the forepart of the Bonadventure. When once on land he manifested a wish to run away. But Cyrus Harding approaching, placed his hand on his shoulder with a gesture full of authority, and looked at him with infinite tenderness. Immediately the unhappy man, submitting to a superior will, gradually became calm, his eyes fell, his head bent, and he made no more resistance. "Poor fellow," murmured the engineer. Cyrus Harding had attentively observed him. To judge by his appearance, this miserable being had no longer anything human about him, and yet Harding, as had the reporter already, observed in his look an indefinable trace of intelligence. It was decided that the castaway, or rather the stranger as he was thenceforth termed by his companions, should live in one of the rooms of Granite House, from which, however, he could not escape. He was led there without difficulty, and with careful attention it might perhaps be hoped that some day he would be a companion to the settlers in Lincoln Island. Cyrus Harding, during breakfast, which Neb had hastened to prepare, as the reporter, Herbert, and Pencroft were dying of hunger, heard in detail all the incidents which had marked the voyage of exploration to the islet. He agreed with his friends on this point, that the stranger must be either English or American, the name Britannia leading them to suppose this, and besides, through the bushy beard, and under the shaggy, matted hair, the engineer thought he could recognize the characteristic features of the Anglo-Saxon. "But, by the by," said Gideon Spilett, addressing Herbert, "you never told us how you met this savage, and we know nothing, except that you would have been strangled if we had not happened to come up in time to help you."
"Upon my word," answered Herbert, "it is rather difficult to say how it happened. I was, I think, occupied in collecting my plants, when I heard a noise like an avalanche falling from a very tall tree. I scarcely had time to look round. This unfortunate man, who was without doubt concealed in a tree, rushed upon me in less time than I take to tell you about it, and unless Mr. Spilett and Pencroft—"
"My boy," said Cyrus Harding, "you ran a great danger, but, perhaps, without that, the poor creature would have still hidden himself from your search, and we should not have had a new companion." "You hope, then, Cyrus, to succeed in reforming the man?" asked the reporter. "Yes," replied the engineer. Breakfast over, Harding and his companions left Granite House and returned to the beach. They there occupied themselves in unloading the Bonadventure, and the engineer, having examined the arms and tools, saw nothing which could help them to establish the identity of the stranger. The capture of pigs made on the islet was looked upon as being very profitable to Lincoln Island, and the animals were led to the sty, where they soon became at home. The 2 barrels, containing the powder and shot, as well as the box of caps, were very welcome. It was agreed to establish a small powder magazine, either outside Granite House or in the upper cavern, where there would be no fear of explosion. However, the use of pyroxyle was to be continued, for this substance giving excellent results, there was no reason for substituting ordinary powder. When the unloading of the vessel was finished, "Captain," said Pencroft, "I think it would be prudent to put our Bonadventure in a safe place." "Is she not safe at the mouth of the Mercy?" asked Cyrus Harding. "No, captain," replied the sailor. "Half of the time she's stranded on the sand, and that works her. She is a famous craft, you see, and she behaved admirably during the squall which struck us on our return." "Could she not float in the river?" "No doubt, captain, she could, but there is no shelter there, and in the east winds I think that the Bonadventure would suffer much from the surf." "Well, where would you put her, Pencroft?" "In Port Balloon," replied the sailor. "That little creek, shut in by rocks, seems to me to be just the harbor we want." "Is it not rather far?" "Pooh! It is not more than 3 miles from Granite House, and we have a fine straight road to take us there." "Do it then, Pencroft, and take your Bonadventure there," replied the engineer. "And yet I would rather have her under our more immediate protection. When we have time, we must make a little harbor for her." "Famous!" exclaimed Pencroft. "A harbor with a lighthouse, a pier, and a dock! Ha! Really, with you, captain, everything becomes easy." "Yes, my brave Pencroft," answered the engineer, "but on condition, however, that you help me, for you do as much as 3 men in all our work." Herbert and the sailor then re-embarked on board the Bonadventure. The anchor was weighed, the sail hoisted, and the wind drove her rapidly towards Claw Cape. 2 hours after, she was imposing on the tranquil waters of Port Balloon. During the first days passed by the stranger in Granite House, had he already given them reason to think that his savage nature was becoming tamed? Did a brighter light burn in the depths of that obscured mind? In short, was the soul returning to the body? Yes, to a certainty, and to such a degree that Cyrus Harding and the reporter wondered if the reason of the unfortunate man had ever been totally extinguished. At first, accustomed to the open air, to the unrestrained liberty which he had enjoyed on Tabor Island, the stranger manifested a sullen fury, and it was feared that he might throw himself onto the beach, out of one of the windows of Granite House. But gradually he became calmer, and more freedom was allowed to his movements. They had reason to hope, and to hope much. Already, forgetting his carnivorous instincts, the stranger accepted a less bestial nourishment than that on which he fed on the islet, and cooked meat did not produce in him the same sentiment of repulsion which he had showed on board the Bonadventure. Cyrus Harding had profited by a moment when he was sleeping to cut his hair and matted beard, which formed a sort of mane and gave him such a savage aspect. He had also been clothed more suitably, after having got rid of the rag which covered him. The result was that, thanks to these attentions, the stranger resumed a more human appearance, and it even seemed as if his eyes had become milder. Certainly, when formerly lighted up by intelligence,
this man's face must have had a sort of beauty. Every day Harding imposed on himself the task of passing some hours in his company. He came and worked near him, and occupied himself in different things, so as to fix his attention. A spark, indeed, would be sufficient to re-illumine that soul, a recollection crossing that brain to recall reason. That had been seen, during the storm, on board the Bonadventure. The engineer did not neglect either to speak aloud, so as to penetrate at the same time by the organs of hearing and sight the depths of that torpid intelligence. Sometimes one of his companions, sometimes another, sometimes all joined him. They spoke most often of things belonging to the Navy, which must interest a sailor. At times the stranger gave some slight attention to what was said, and the settlers were soon convinced that he partly understood them. Sometimes the expression of his countenance was deeply sorrowful, a proof that he suffered mentally, for his face could not be mistaken. But he did not speak, although at different times, however, they almost thought that words were about to issue from his lips. At all events, the poor creature was quite quiet and sad. But was not his calm only apparent? Was not his sadness only the result of his seclusion? Nothing could yet be ascertained. Seeing only certain objects and in a limited space, always in contact with the colonists, to whom he would soon become accustomed, having no desires to satisfy, better fed, better clothed, it was natural that his physical nature should gradually improve. But was he penetrated with the sense of a new life? Or rather, to employ a word which must be exactly applicable to him, was he not becoming tamed, like an animal in company with his master? This was an important question, which Cyrus Harding was anxious to answer, and yet he did not wish to treat his invalid roughly. Would he ever be a convalescent? How the engineer observed him every moment! How he was on the watch for his soul, if one may use the expression! How he was ready to grasp it! The settlers followed with real sympathy all the phases of the cure undertaken by Harding. They aided him also in this work of humanity, and all, except perhaps the incredulous Pencroft, soon shared both his hope and his faith. The calm of the stranger was deep, as has been said, and he even showed a sort of attachment for the engineer, whose influence he evidently felt. Cyrus Harding resolved then to try him, by transporting him to another scene, from that ocean which formerly his eyes had been accustomed to contemplate, to the border of the forest, which might perhaps recall those where so many years of his life had been passed.
"But," said Gideon Spilett, "can we hope that he will not escape, if once set at liberty?"
"The experiment must be tried," replied the engineer.
"Well," said Pencroft, "when that fellow's outside, and feels the fresh air, he will be off as fast as his legs can carry him."
"I do not think so," returned Harding.
"Let us try," said Spilett.
"We will try," replied the engineer. This was on the 30th of October, and consequently the castaway of Tabor Island had been a prisoner in Granite House for 9 days. It was warm, and a bright sun darted its rays on the island. Cyrus Harding and Pencroft went to the room occupied by the stranger, who was found lying near the window and gazing at the sky.
"Come, my friend," said the engineer to him.
The stranger rose immediately. His eyes were fixed on Cyrus Harding, and he followed him, while the sailor marched behind them, little confident as to the result of the experiment. Arrived at the door, Harding and Pencroft made him take his place in the lift, while Neb, Herbert, and Gideon Spilett waited for them before Granite House. The lift descended, and in a few moments all were united on the beach. The settlers went a short distance from the stranger, so as to leave him at liberty. He then made a few steps toward the sea, and his look brightened with extreme animation, but he did not make the slightest attempt to escape. He was gazing at the little waves which, broken by the islet, rippled on the sand.
"This is only the sea," observed Gideon Spilett, and possibly it does not inspire him with any wish to escape." "Yes," replied Harding, "we must take him to the plateau, on the border of the forest. There the experiment will be more conclusive." "Besides, he could not run away," said Neb, "since the bridge is raised." "Oh," said Pencroft, "that isn't a man to be troubled by a stream like Creek Glycerine. He could cross it directly at a single bound." "We shall soon see," Harding contented himself with replying, his eyes not quitting those of his patient. The latter was then led towards the mouth of the Mersey, and all climbing the left bank of the river reached Prospect Heights. Arrived at the spot on which grew the first beautiful trees of the forest, their foliage slightly agitated by the breeze, the stranger appeared greedily to drink in the penetrating odor which filled the atmosphere, and a long sigh escaped from his chest. The settlers kept behind him, ready to seize him if he made any movement to escape. And indeed, the poor creature was on the point of springing into the creek which separated him from the forest, and his legs were bent for an instant as if for a spring, but almost immediately he stepped back, half sank down, and a large tear fell from his eyes. "Ah!" exclaimed Cyrus Harding, "you have become a man again, for you can weep." End of chapter. The Mysterious Island by Jules Verne. Part 2, Chapter 16. Yes, the unfortunate man had wept. Some recollection doubtless had flashed across his brain, and to use Cyrus Harding's expression, by those tears he was once more a man. The colonists left him for some time on the plateau, and withdrew themselves to a short distance, so that he might feel himself free. But he did not think of profiting by this liberty, and Harding soon brought him back to Granite House. 2 days after this occurrence, the stranger appeared to wish gradually to mingle with their common life. He evidently heard and understood, but no less evidently was he strangely determined not to speak to the colonists. For one evening, Pencroft, listening at the door of his room, heard these words escape from his lips: "No! Here! I never!" The sailor reported these words to his companions. "There is some painful mystery there," said Harding. The stranger had begun to use the laboring tools, and he worked in the garden. When he stopped in his work, as was often the case, he remained retired within himself, but on the engineer's recommendation, they respected the reserve which he apparently wished to keep. If one of the settlers approached him, he drew back, and his chest heaved with sobs, as if overburdened. Was it remorse that overwhelmed him thus? They were compelled to believe so, and Gideon Spilett could not help one day making this observation: "If he does not speak, it is because he has, I fear, things too serious to be told." They must be patient and wait. A few days later, on the 3rd of November, the stranger, working on the plateau, had stopped, letting his spade drop to the ground, and Harding, who was observing him from a little distance, saw that tears were again flowing from his eyes. A sort of irresistible pity led him towards the unfortunate man, and he touched his arm lightly. "My friend," said he. The stranger tried to avoid his look, and Cyrus Harding having endeavored to take his hand, he drew back quickly. "My friend," said Harding in a firmer voice, "look at me. I wish it." The stranger looked at the engineer and seemed to be under his power, as a subject under the influence of a mesmerist. He wished to run away, but then his countenance suddenly underwent a transformation. His eyes flashed. Words struggled to escape from his lips. He could no longer contain himself. At last he folded his arms, then in a hollow voice, "Who are you?" he asked Cyrus Harding. "Castaways, like you," replied the engineer, whose emotion was deep.
We have brought you here among your fellow men."
"My fellow men? I have none."
"You are in the midst of friends."
"Friends? For me?"
"Friends!" exclaimed the stranger, hiding his face in his hands.
"No, never. Leave me, leave me."
Then he rushed to the side of the plateau which overlooked the sea, and remained there a long time motionless. Harding rejoined his companions and related to them what had just happened.
"Yes, there is some mystery in that man's life," said Gideon Spilett, "and it appears as if he had only re-entered society by the path of remorse." "I don't know what sort of man we have brought here," said the sailor. "He has secrets." "Which we will respect," interrupted Cyrus Harding quickly. "If he has committed any crime, he has most fearfully expiated it, and in our eyes he is absolved." For 2 hours the stranger remained alone on the shore, evidently under the influence of recollections which recalled all his past life, a melancholy life doubtless, and the colonists, without losing sight of him, did not attempt to disturb his solitude. However, after 2 hours, appearing to have formed a resolution, he came to find Cyrus Harding. His eyes were red with the tears he had shed, but he wept no longer. His countenance expressed deep humility. He appeared anxious, timorous, ashamed, and his eyes were constantly fixed on the ground. "Sir," said he to Harding, "your companions and you, are you English?" "No," answered the engineer, "we are Americans." "Ah,"
said the stranger, and he murmured, "I prefer that."
"And you, my friend?" asked the engineer.
"English," replied he hastily. And as if these few words had been difficult to say, he retreated to the beach, where he walked up and down between the cascade and the mouth of the Mersey in a state of extreme agitation. Then, passing one moment close to Herbert, he stopped and in a stifled voice, "What month?" he asked. "December," replied Herbert.
"What year?"
1866.
12 years! 12 years!"
he exclaimed. Then he left him abruptly. Herbert reported to the colonists the questions and answers which had been made.
"This unfortunate man," observed Gideon Spilett, "was no longer acquainted with either months or years."
"Yes," added Herbert, "and he had been 12 years already on the islet when we found him there."
12 years, rejoined Harding. "Ah, 12 years of solitude, after a wicked life perhaps, may well impair a man's reason." "I am induced to think," said Pencroft, "that this man was not wrecked on Tabor Island, but that in consequence of some crime he was left there." "You might be right, Pencroft," replied the reporter, "and if it is so, it is not impossible that those who left him on the island may return to fetch him some day."
"And that they will no longer find him," said Herbert.
"But then," added Pencroft, "they must return and—"
"My friends," said Cyrus Harding, "do not let us discuss this question until we know more about it. I believe that the unhappy man has suffered, that he has severely expiated his faults, whatever they may have been, and that the wish to unburden himself stifles him. Do not let us press him to tell us his history. He will tell it to us, doubtless, and when we know it, we shall see what course it will be best to follow. He alone, besides, can tell us if he has more than a hope, a certainty, of returning some day to his country, but I doubt it."
"And why?"
asked the reporter. "Because that, in the event of his being sure of his being delivered at a certain time, he would have waited the hour of his deliverance, and would not have thrown this document into the sea. No, it is more probable that he was condemned to die on that islet, and that he never expected to see his fellow creatures again."
"But," observed the sailor, "there is one thing which I cannot explain."
"What is it?"
If this man had been left for 12 years on Tabor Island, one may well suppose that he had been several years already in the wild state in which we found him." "That is probable," replied Cyrus Harding. "It must then be many years since he wrote that document." "No doubt, and yet the document appears to have been recently written." "Besides, how do you know that the bottle which enclosed the document may not have taken several years to come from Tabor Island to Lincoln Island?" "That is not absolutely impossible," replied the reporter. "Might it not have been a long time already on the coast of the island?" "No," answered Pencroft, "for it was still floating. We could not even suppose that after it had stayed for any length of time on the shore it would have been swept off by the sea, for the south coast is all rocks, and it would certainly have been smashed to pieces there." "That is true," rejoined Cyrus Harding thoughtfully. "And then," continued the sailor, "if the document was several years old, if it had been shut up in that bottle for several years, it would have been injured by damp. Now there is nothing of the kind, and it was found in a perfect state of preservation." The sailor's reasoning was very just, and pointed out an incomprehensible fact, for the document appeared to have been recently written, when the colonists found it in the bottle. Moreover, it gave the latitude and longitude of Tabor Island correctly, which implied that its author had a more complete knowledge of hydrography than could be expected of a common sailor. "There is in this, again, something unaccountable," said the engineer. "But we will not urge our companion to speak. When he likes, my friends, then we shall be ready to hear him." During the following days the stranger did not speak a word, and did not once leave the precincts of the plateau. He worked away, without losing a moment, without taking a minute's rest, but always in a retired place. At meal-times he never came to Granite House, although invited several times to do so, but contented himself with eating a few raw vegetables. At nightfall he did not return to the room assigned to him, but remained under some clump of trees, or when the weather was bad crouched in some cleft of the rocks. Thus he lived in the same manner as when he had no other shelter than the forest of Tabor Island, and as all persuasion to induce him to improve his life was in vain, the colonists waited patiently. And the time was near when, as it seemed, almost involuntarily urged by his conscience, a terrible confession escaped him. On the 10th of November, about 8 o'clock in the evening, as night was coming on, the stranger appeared unexpectedly before the settlers, who were assembled under the veranda. His eyes burned strangely, and he had quite resumed the wild aspect of his worst days. Cyrus Harding and his companions were astounded on seeing that, overcome by some terrible emotion, his teeth chattered like those of a person in a fever. What was the matter with him? Was the sight of his fellow creatures insupportable to him? Was he weary of this return to a civilized mode of existence? Was he pining for his former savage life? It appeared so, as soon he was heard to express himself in these incoherent sentences. "Why am I here? By what right have you dragged me from my islet? Do you think there could be any tie between you and me? Do you know who I am? What I have done? Why I was there alone? And who told you that I was not abandoned there, that I was not condemned to die there? Do you know my past? How do you know that I have not stolen, murdered, that I am not a wretch, an accursed being, only fit to live like a wild beast, far from all? Speak! Do you know it?" The colonists listened without interrupting the miserable creature, from whom these broken confessions escaped, as it were, in spite of himself. Harding wished to calm him, approached him, but he hastily drew back. "No, no," he exclaimed. "One word only. Am I free?" "You are free," answered the engineer. "Farewell, then," he cried, and fled like a madman. Neb, Pencroft, and Herbert ran also towards the edge of the wood, but they returned alone.
"We must let him alone," said Cyrus Harding.
"He will never come back!"
exclaimed Pencroft. "He will come back," replied the engineer. Many days passed, but Harding, was it a sort of presentiment, persisted in the fixed idea that sooner or later the unhappy man would return. "It is the last revolt of his wild nature," said he, "which remorse has touched, and which renewed solitude will terrify." In the meanwhile, works of all sorts were continued, as well on Prospect Heights as at the corral, where Harding intended to build a farm. It is unnecessary to say that the seeds collected by Herbert on Tabor Island had been carefully sown. The plateau thus formed one immense kitchen garden, well laid out and carefully tended, so that the arms of the settlers were never in want of work. There was always something to be done. As the esculents increased in number, it became necessary to enlarge the simple beds, which threatened to grow into regular fields and replace the meadows. But grass abounded in other parts of the island, and there was no fear of the onagers being obliged to go on short allowance. It was well worth while, besides, to turn Prospect Heights into a kitchen garden, defended by its deep belt of creeks, and to remove them to the meadows, which had no need of protection against the depredations of quadrumana and quadrupeds. On the 15th of November the third harvest was gathered in. How wonderfully had the field increased in extent since 18 months ago, when the first grain of wheat was sown! The second crop of 600,000 grains produced this time 4,000 bushels, or 500 millions of grains. The colony was rich in corn, for 10 bushels alone were sufficient for sowing every year to produce an ample crop for the food both of men and beasts. The harvest was completed, and the last fortnight of the month of November was devoted to the work of converting it into food for man. In fact, they had corn, but no flour, and the establishment of a mill was necessary. Cyrus Harding could have utilized the second fall which flowed into the Mersey to establish his motive power, the first being already occupied with moving the felting mill. But after some consultation, it was decided that a simple windmill should be built on Prospect Heights. The building of this presented no more difficulty than the building of the former, and it was moreover certain that there would be no want of wind on the plateau, exposed as it was to the sea breezes. "Not to mention," said Pencroft, "that the windmill will be more lively and will have a good effect in the landscape." They set to work by choosing timber for the frame and machinery of the mill. Some large stones, found at the north of the lake, could be easily transformed into millstones, and as to the sails, the inexhaustible case of the balloon furnished the necessary material. Cyrus Harding made his model, and the site of the mill was chosen a little to the right of the poultry yard, near the shore of the lake. The frame was to rest on a pivot supported with strong timbers, so that it could turn with all the machinery it contained, according as the wind required it. The work advanced rapidly. Neb and Pencroft had become very skilful carpenters, and had nothing to do but to copy the models provided by the engineer. Soon a sort of cylindrical box, in shape like a pepper pot, with a pointed roof, rose on the spot chosen. The 4 frames which formed the sails had been firmly fixed in the center beam, so as to form a certain angle with it, and secured with iron clamps. As to the different parts of the internal mechanism, the box destined to contain the 2 millstones, the fixed stone, and the moving stone, the hopper, a sort of large square trough, wide at the top, narrow at the bottom, which would allow the grain to fall on the stones, the oscillating spout intended to regulate the passing of the grain, and lastly the bolting machine, which by the operation of sifting separates the bran from the flour, were made without difficulty. The tools were good, and the work not difficult,
for in reality the machinery of a mill is very simple. This was only a question of time. Everyone had worked at the construction of the mill, and on the 1st of December it was finished. As usual, Pencroft was delighted with his work, and had no doubt that the apparatus was perfect. "Now for a good wind," said he, "and we shall grind our first harvest splendidly." "A good wind, certainly," answered the engineer, "but not too much, Pencroft." "Pooh! Our mill could only go the faster." "There is no need for it to go very fast," replied Cyrus Harding. "It is known by experience that the greatest quantity of work is performed by a mill when the number of turns made by the sails in a minute is 6 times the number of feet traversed by the wind in a second. A moderate breeze, which passes over 24 feet to the second, will give 16 turns to the sails during a minute, and there is no need of more." "Exactly," cried Herbert. "A fine breeze is blowing from the northeast, which will soon do our business for us." There was no reason for delaying the inauguration of the mill, for the settlers were eager to taste the first piece of bread in Lincoln Island. On this morning 2 or 3 bushels of wheat were ground, and the next day at breakfast a magnificent loaf, a little heavy perhaps, although raised with yeast, appeared on the table at Granite House. Every one munched away at it with a pleasure which may be easily understood. In the meantime the stranger had not reappeared. Several times Gideon Spilett and Herbert searched the forest in the neighborhood of Granite House, without meeting or finding any trace of him. They became seriously uneasy at this prolonged absence. Certainly the former savage of Tabor Island could not be perplexed how to live in the forest, abounding in game, but was it not to be feared that he had resumed his habits, and that this freedom would revive in him his wild instincts? However, Harding, by a sort of presentiment, doubtless, always persisted in saying that the fugitive would return. "Yes, he will return," he repeated with a confidence which his companions could not share. "When this unfortunate man was on Tabor Island, he knew himself to be alone. Here he knows that fellow men are awaiting him. Since he has partially spoken of his past life, the poor penitent will return to tell the whole, and from that day he will belong to us." The event justified Cyrus Harding's predictions. On the 3rd of December, Herbert had left the plateau to go and fish on the southern bank of the lake. He was unarmed, and till then had never taken any precautions for defense, as dangerous animals had not shown themselves on that part of the island. Meanwhile, Pencroft and Neb were working in the poultry yard, while Harding and the reporter were occupied at the chimneys in making soda, the store of soap being exhausted. Suddenly cries resounded, "Help! Help!" Cyrus Harding and the reporter, being at too great a distance, had not been able to hear the shouts. Pencroft and Neb, leaving the poultry yard in all haste, rushed towards the lake. But before them the stranger, whose presence at this place no one had suspected, crossed Creek Glycerine, which separated the plateau from the forest, and bounded up the opposite bank. Herbert was there face to face with a fierce jaguar, similar to the one which had been killed on Reptile End. Suddenly surprised, he was standing with his back against a tree, while the animal, gathering itself together, was about to spring. But the stranger, with no other weapon than a knife, rushed on the formidable animal, who turned to meet this new adversary. The struggle was short. The stranger possessed immense strength and activity. He seized the jaguar's throat with one powerful hand, holding it as in a vise, without heeding the beast's claws which tore his flesh, and with the other he plunged his knife into its heart. The jaguar fell. The stranger kicked away the body, and was about to fly at the moment when the settlers arrived on the field of battle, but Herbert, clinging to him, cried, "No, no, you shall not go!" Harding advanced towards the stranger, who frowned when he saw him approaching. The blood flowed from his shoulder under his torn shirt, but he took no notice of it. "My friend," said Cyrus Harding, "we have just contracted a debt of gratitude to you. To save our boy you have risked your life." "My life!" murmured the stranger. "What is that worth?" "Less than nothing." "You are wounded?" "It is no matter." "Will you give me your hand?" And as Herbert endeavored to seize the hand which had just saved him, the stranger folded his arms, his chest heaved, his look darkened, and he appeared to wish to escape, but making a violent effort over himself, and in an abrupt tone, "Who are you?" he asked, "and what do you claim to be to me?" It was the colonist's history which he thus demanded, and for the first time. Perhaps this history recounted he would tell his own. In a few words Harding related all that had happened since their departure from Richmond, how they had managed, and what resources they now had at their disposal. The stranger listened with extreme attention. Then the engineer told who they all were: Gideon Spilett, Herbert, Pencroft, Neb, himself, and, he added, that the greatest happiness they had felt since their arrival in Lincoln Island was on the return of the vessel from Tabor Island, when they had been able to include among them a new companion. At these words the stranger's face flushed, his head sunk on his breast, and confusion was depicted on his countenance. "And now you know us," added Cyrus Harding. "Will you give us your hand?" "No," replied the stranger in a hoarse voice. "No, you are honest men, and I—" End of chapter.